They say a family's true story is hidden in the quietest corners of its home, in objects that seem ordinary, in things people never think to look at. But sometimes, those objects speak louder than voices ever could. Imagine standing in a room that's been your family's sanctuary for decades, surrounded by wealth, photographs of smiles frozen in time, walls lined with the history of a life everyone admired from the outside. And then you see it. A small, unassuming jewelry box, tucked away in a drawer that had always seemed insignificant, a piece of furniture you'd passed 100 times without a second thought. That box was about to shatter everything you thought you knew. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Jake Reiner had no idea what he was about to find. A simple act of opening a box would turn his world upside down. What lay inside wasn't just metal or gems. It was truth, a truth that had been hidden for decades, buried beneath layers of wealth, appearances, and silence. And as he lifted the lid, the weight of years of secrecy pressed down on him like a hand he couldn't shake. The tears came quickly, almost involuntarily, because in that small, delicate container was proof that his father, Rob Reiner, the man the world knew as a loving husband, a celebrated director, a father, had a secret life that no one had suspected. The first thing Jake noticed was a ring. Not just any ring, a wedding ring. But this ring wasn't meant for the woman standing by his father's side for over 40 years. Its engraving told a story the family had never shared, a story no one outside this house could have guessed. And suddenly, the neat, orderly life he thought he knew seemed like a carefully constructed illusion. A single ring became the key to a labyrinth of secrets, betrayals, and hidden family ties that had been meticulously protected, even from him. How could a single object carry so much weight? How could a symbol of love and commitment be wielded in secrecy, tearing apart the lives of those it was meant to unite? Jake's mind raced, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the father he had known. The man who had held him on his shoulders, who had guided him through life's simplest lessons, who had been a public icon of honesty and integrity. How could he have lived a hidden life right under everyone's nose? There were questions, too many to count. Who else knew about this? Was it a fleeting romance or a long-term arrangement no one dared to acknowledge? And if Rob Reiner had another family, who were they? And how had he managed to keep them invisible for so long? The stakes of this discovery became even heavier because of recent events. Only days before, tragedy had struck the Reiner family in a way that no one could have predicted. Rob and Michelle Reiner were found brutally stabbed to death at their $13.5 million Brentwood estate, a shocking crime that sent ripples through both Hollywood and the world at large. Their son, Nick, had been living in the guest house, and by the end of that night, he was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The story was already a nightmare, a family destroyed in the most violent, incomprehensible way possible, but Jake's discovery added another layer, a secret that suggested there was more to this family than anyone had ever imagined. Could these hidden truths have played a role in what happened? Was the jewelry box a clue, a piece of a puzzle that might finally explain why such a horrific event occurred? Reports claimed that the bodies had been discovered by the Reiner's daughter, Romy, who allegedly warned police about a dangerous family member, someone who might have been a suspect even before the events unfolded. These words would haunt investigators, friends, and the public alike, hinting at undercurrents of tension, fear, and mistrust that had been simmering for years. Jake's heart sank as he thought about Romy, her position in this family, and the warnings she had issued. Could she have sensed the shadow of betrayal, the silent fractures in a household that appeared perfect on the surface? And more importantly, how did these hidden dynamics intersect with the secret symbolized by the wedding ring? As Jake's fingers traced the delicate engraving, memories of his childhood began to collide with the present. Every holiday, every family gathering, every moment that had seemed ordinary was suddenly viewed through a lens of suspicion. Was the warmth genuine, or was it a performance? Was love as real as he had believed, or had it been calculated, compartmentalized, hidden behind smiles that no one could trust completely? The realization that someone he trusted completely had a secret life was a psychic blow. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a rewriting of history, a collapse of the foundation upon which he had built his understanding of his family. Yet the emotional weight of the jewelry box wasn't just about deceit. It was about missed opportunities, about lives that could have been different if honesty had prevailed. Jake thought about the other family, the one who might have been waiting, the one who had no idea they were part of this story until now. Was there a spouse, a partner, perhaps even children, who had been living in a parallel reality, invisible to the world, invisible to their own father? The thought made Jake shiver. Secrets this monumental weren't just private, they were disruptive, capable of tearing lives apart in ways no one could anticipate. And now, with the tragedy of his parents' death as a backdrop, the stakes were incomparably higher. Even the physicality of the jewelry box itself seemed to speak. Its weight, its cold metallic clasp, the velvet lining inside, all suggested care, intentionality, a desire to conceal rather than reveal. This was not an object left to chance. It was a vault, a container of truth that only the most daring, or perhaps the most desperate, would open. Jake could feel the tension in his own chest, the pulse of history pressing down on him. Every breath, every heartbeat, every thought was drawn into the gravity of the discovery. How much could one box, one ring, one secret alter the perception of a life that had been lived in the public eye for decades? And then there was the question of timing. Why now? Why had this box remained untouched, hidden from everyone, until Jake finally lifted the lid? Was it luck, fate, or intention? Had Rob Reiner known, in some prescient way, that his death would eventually reveal these truths? Or was this coincidence, a cruel twist in a family already grappling with unimaginable loss? The uncertainty gnawed at Jake's mind, and by extension, at the minds of everyone watching this story unfold. As the minutes stretched into hours, as memories intertwined with evidence, Jake realized something else. This discovery was not the end. It was the beginning of a journey, a descent into questions no one in the family could have predicted. Who was the mysterious figure connected to this ring? How deep did the deception run? And perhaps most frighteningly, could uncovering these truths have consequences that reached even beyond the tragedy already suffered? The jewelry box, once a minor piece of the household, had become the epicenter of a mystery that threatened to destabilize everything Jake thought he knew. By the end of that night, Jake was left with more questions than answers. Tears stained his face, but they were not just for grief. They were for confusion, for anger, for a profound sense of loss that extended beyond his parents' deaths. The world he had known was shifting beneath his feet, reshaping itself into something unrecognizable. And as he closed the box, as he took a moment to breathe, he knew one thing with terrifying clarity. The secrets it contained would not stay hidden for long. Someone else knew, someone else had been living with these truths, and soon, the ramifications of this discovery would ripple outward in ways that no one could predict. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They say every house has a story, but some houses tell stories even when their walls are silent. The Reiner estate, perched atop a sun-drenched hill in Brentwood, was one of those houses. From the outside, it gleamed like a jewel among the oaks. Pristine lawns, towering gates, and an air of untouchable wealth. To the casual observer, it was a place of comfort, privilege, and family. But to those who lived within, the mansion was a labyrinth of secrets, of hidden doors and concealed truths, where the weight of appearances pressed down heavier than the California sun. From the moment Jake first stepped onto the property, he felt it, an almost tangible tension in the air. The sprawling estate stretched across acres, yet every footstep seemed to echo with the absence of trust. The main house, where Rob and Michelle had lived for decades, was meticulously maintained, a shrine to taste and legacy. Rooms were filled with polished wood, muted carpets, and the kind of furniture that whispered of elegance rather than comfort. Every object seemed curated, carefully chosen to convey success and stability. But for those living inside, this curated perfection was a mask, hiding something more volatile beneath the surface. The guest house, where Nick had spent so many years, was a mirror of the main house's refinement, but with a subtle undercurrent of neglect. It was smaller, quieter, seemingly less attended to, but it carried its own weight, the weight of someone trying to exist in the shadow of a family empire. Nick's life in the guest house was a story in itself. A son physically close to his parents, yet emotionally distant, living under the same roof, but in a world of his own. And though the house was designed to impress, it never truly concealed the tensions that festered within its walls. Every room seemed to hum with secrets, every hallway a corridor of unspoken words. Jake often thought about how the physical structure of the house mirrored the family itself. The main house was public, polished, the part everyone could see and admire. The guest house was private, hidden, and home to struggles that few could witness. The contrast between the two buildings was stark, a metaphor in concrete and stone. And the jewelry box, small and unassuming, seemed like a final piece in this architecture of secrecy, a quiet object capable of unraveling everything. Life in the Reiner estate had always appeared perfect from the outside. Rob and Michelle, the glamorous couple celebrated in Hollywood circles, hosted dinners, attended premieres, and maintained the image of a loving, harmonious family. Photographs captured smiling faces, laughter frozen in time, vacations that looked like they belonged in magazines. But these images were carefully constructed, edited moments meant to tell a story of love, success, and stability. Behind closed doors, reality was far more complex. Relationships were strained, loyalties tested, and emotions buried under layers of politeness and performance. Jake remembered the first time he realized this. He was a child, visiting the estate for a holiday gathering. The laughter was there, yes, but so was a tension that made his stomach knot. He noticed the brief glances exchanged between his parents, the way certain topics were avoided, the way some doors were always locked. At the time, he dismissed it as adult behavior, something he would grow to understand later. But now, with the tragic deaths of Rob and Michelle, and the shocking discovery in the jewelry box, those childhood instincts seemed eerily prescient. The house had been telling him its story all along, and he had been too young to listen. The estate's layout also contributed to the sense of unease. The main house and guest house were connected by a winding driveway flanked by tall hedges, which created both privacy and isolation. While this design ensured that neighbors or prying eyes could not intrude, it also created a sense of confinement. The family moved through their world physically close, yet emotionally distant, their interactions measured and deliberate. Even routine conversations were filtered through layers of expectation, of politeness masking tension. And in this environment, objects like the jewelry box took on extraordinary significance. They were not mere possessions, but vessels of hidden truths, tiny explosions waiting for the right moment to detonate. The tension within the estate was compounded by the nature of its inhabitants. Rob Reiner, celebrated as a director and cultural figure, carried the weight of public expectation. To the world, he was articulate, thoughtful, and seemingly invulnerable. But within the walls of his own home, he was human, flawed, and perhaps even burdened by secrets that he could not share. Michelle, too, projected grace and composure, but beneath the polished exterior was a woman navigating the complex dynamics of family, secrecy, and personal loyalty. And Nick, in his quiet corner of the guest house, embodied the pressure of living in the shadow of a legendary father while harboring his own struggles, frustrations, and perhaps resentments. Jake had spent hours wandering the estate after the tragedy, trying to reconcile the house he knew with the events that had unfolded. Every room, every hallway, every piece of furniture seemed to carry echoes of the past. He would stand in a corner of the living room, looking at the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and imagine conversations that had never happened, apologies that had been left unsaid, arguments that had simmered in silence. The physical space of the estate became a metaphor for the emotional landscape of the family, a landscape marked by wealth, privilege, and glamour, but also by distance, secrecy, and unspoken pain. It was in this context that the jewelry box took on its immense significance. Small, heavy, velvet-lined, it was tucked away in a drawer that Jake had opened countless times without noticing. But on that day, it was as if the house itself had guided his hand, insisting that he lift the lid and confront what lay inside. The discovery was not just a matter of curiosity. It was a confrontation with history, with secrets that had been carefully curated and concealed for decades. and the fact that it had remained untouched until now suggested intention. This was not an accident. The house had waited patiently for the right person at the right moment to uncover the truth. Jake's exploration of the estate also brought him face to face with the question of legacy. What does it mean to inherit a family, to step into a life shaped by those who came before? The Reiner estate, with all its beauty and complexity, was a testament to success, but it was also a reminder that success can coexist with profound dysfunction. The polished exterior of the house, the immaculate lawns, the elegant interiors, all masked the fractures within. And the jewelry box, hidden away in plain sight, symbolized the aspects of family that are often invisible: secrets, betrayals, and lives lived in the shadows. As the sun dipped behind the hills that framed the property, the house seemed to change. Shadows stretched across the walls, corridors grew darker, and the weight of history pressed down on every corner. Jake felt the presence of his parents in a new, almost tangible way. Not as the figures he remembered from childhood, but as adults navigating their own complex realities, carrying secrets, and making choices that had far-reaching consequences. The house was more than architecture. It was a living chronicle of decisions, mistakes, and hidden truths. And yet, despite all the tragedy and tension, there was a magnetic pull to the estate, an undeniable connection to the family's history. Jake realized that understanding the house, its layout, its secrets, was a way of understanding his parents, and perhaps even himself. Every step, every room, every locked drawer offered a clue, a fragment of a larger story that had been unfolding for decades. The jewelry box was the first, but surely not the last, doorway into that story. But as night fell, casting long shadows across the estate, Jake knew that the house, for all its beauty and grandeur, held dangers that were more than metaphorical. Objects, memories, and secrets could wound as deeply as any blade. And the jewelry box, small and unassuming, had already done just that. What other revelations lay hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to discover them? What came next in the estate would shock Jake to his core and change everything he thought he knew about his family. It started as an ordinary evening, the kind of night that gives no warning of the horrors it can hold. The Brentwood estate was quiet, the sun long set behind the hills, and the glow of the city below seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Inside, the Reiner family moved through their routines, unaware that by the end of hours, everything they knew about safety, love, and trust would be irrevocably shattered. This was not a night defined by subtle tension or creeping unease. It was a night that exploded, leaving devastation in its wake. Jake often replayed the timeline in his mind, each detail sharper and more haunting with every recollection. It began with the stillness, the almost unnatural calm that descended on the estate. Lights were on, hallways were lit, but there was a sense of expectation, as if the house itself had braced for something terrible. Then came the sounds, small at first. A thump, a creak, a muffled cry that seemed impossible to locate. In a home that had always felt both grand and isolated, those noises were enough to set nerves on edge. Someone was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the consequences would be irreversible. The discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's bodies was a scene that no one could forget. Reports indicate that Romy, their 27-year-old daughter, was the one who found them. Witness accounts suggest her shock was immediate and complete. Imagine walking into the room where your parents should have been the picture of calm and comfort, only to find a reality so brutal it defies comprehension. There were no immediate answers, only questions, screams, and a growing sense of disbelief. The tragedy was sudden, violent, and impossible to rationalize. Police reports later revealed chilling details. The Reiners had been stabbed multiple times, a brutal act of violence in a home that had always projected refinement, control, and composure. Their deaths were not only a personal loss, they were a rupture in the image of a family that Hollywood and the world had come to admire. For those who knew the family, or only thought they did, the shock was compounded by the contrast between the public perception and private reality. On the surface, Rob Reiner was a celebrated director, Michelle a poised partner and mother, and their children seemed well-adjusted, successful, and secure. Beneath that surface, however, tensions, secrets, and emotional complexities had been accumulating, invisible until that one night exposed them in the most violent way imaginable. Nick Reiner, living in the guest house at the time, became the focal point of the investigation almost immediately. Within hours of the tragedy, police had arrested him on suspicion of first-degree murder. The questions surrounding his motive, his mental state, and his relationship with his parents dominated the early media coverage. But Nick's story, like so many elements of this family, was layered, nuanced, and opaque. He had lived close to the family physically, yet he was isolated emotionally, and the guest house that separated him from the main house became a symbol of the distance that existed long before the tragedy. It was as if he had been living in a parallel world, one that would collide catastrophically with the main family narrative on that fateful night. Romy's involvement added another layer of complexity. Allegedly, she had warned the police about a dangerous family member, someone who might have been a suspect even before the events occurred. Her words, both cryptic and urgent, hinted at fractures within the family that outsiders could not see. The police, the media, and the public were left to speculate about what she had meant. Was it Nick she was referring to? Or someone else, hidden in plain sight, whose presence in the family's history had been carefully concealed? Jake would later realize that Romy's insight was crucial, an early signal of the hidden dynamics that had governed their lives, yet it was a warning that only in retrospect revealed its full significance. As the investigation unfolded, the estate itself became a silent witness to the horrors of that night. Every hallway, every doorway, every room was a potential piece of evidence, a fragment of the story that the police and family members had to piece together. The main house, which had always seemed orderly, suddenly felt like a labyrinth of clues and secrets. The guest house, once a space of relative privacy, became a center of scrutiny, each detail scrutinized for signs of motive or intent. The estate, in all its grandeur, had become a crime scene, a stage for events that would ripple through the lives of everyone connected to it. Jake's own experience that night was one of emotional disorientation. The shock of losing both parents, the fear for his siblings, the confusion over Nick's involvement, and the weight of the family's secrets, all collided at once. His grief was not linear, it was jagged, a series of waves that threatened to overwhelm him at every turn. And as he processed the tragedy, his attention returned, almost instinctively, to the small jewelry box he had found days earlier. In that moment, it was no longer a mere object. It became a touchstone, a fragile piece of truth in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. The juxtaposition of violence and discovery created an almost unbearable tension. On the one hand, Jake was confronting the reality of murder, the brutal end of the lives of those he loved. On the other hand, he was grappling with revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew about his family's history, their relationships, and their integrity. The jewelry box, the secret ring, and the hidden life of his father suddenly became more than curiosities. They were keys to understanding the deeper, more insidious forces that had shaped the family's dynamics. Could these secrets have contributed, in some way, to the tragedy that had unfolded? Jake did not yet know, but the possibility gnawed at him relentlessly. The night itself, reconstructed in Jake's mind, was a montage of fear, confusion, and partial clarity. The sounds of the city outside, the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional siren became a soundtrack for a family's collapse. He thought about Romy's reaction, the police's initial impressions, the media frenzy that would follow, and the countless private conversations that had gone unsaid for years. All of these elements converged in a single, horrifying evening that would mark the family forever. And yet, amid all the chaos, the jewelry box remained, almost defiantly, a symbol of the truths that were still waiting to be fully uncovered. This convergence of tragedy and revelation forced Jake to confront the nature of memory and perception. How much of what he remembered about his parents was real, and how much was shaped by image, expectation, or denial? The perfect life he had believed in, the stories he had told himself, the carefully curated moments of family unity. They all seemed to fracture under the weight of that night's events. And in the silence that followed, In the moments between media headlines and police reports, Jake began to understand that the real story was not just about murder. It was about the invisible, intricate web of secrets, lies, and hidden truths that had governed every interaction, every decision, every moment of family life. Even as he tried to reconcile these realities, Jake knew that he was only scratching the surface. The estate, the guest house, the jewelry box, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, one that would take months, years, perhaps even a lifetime, to fully understand. And while the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner were the most immediate, visible tragedy, the deeper, more insidious story was unfolding in the shadows, in the corners of the estate, in the locked drawers and hidden compartments where secrets had lain undisturbed. The night everything broke was just the beginning. It was a fracture point, the moment when carefully maintained facades collapsed and the true shape of the family emerged, jagged and painful. By the time the sun rose on the Brentwood estate, the world outside had changed as well. News outlets reported on the shocking murders, on Nick's arrest, and on Romy's cryptic warning. Friends and extended family struggled to comprehend the scale of the loss. But inside the house, amid the debris of grief and confusion, Jake realized that the jewelry box and the secrets it contained was central to understanding not only what had happened but why. Every glance, every memory, every object in the house was suddenly imbued with new significance, a reminder that the past and present were colliding in ways that could not be ignored. And as Jake stood alone in the main house, staring at the empty spaces that had once held laughter, arguments, and ordinary family life, he understood something terrifying. The tragedy of that night was only the surface. Beneath it lay questions that demanded answers, secrets that demanded exposure, and truths that could not remain hidden any longer. The night everything broke had opened a door, and once opened, there was no turning back. What Jake would discover next inside the estate, inside the jewelry box, would reveal layers of his family he had never imagined, secrets that could change not only his understanding of his parents, but the very foundation of what it meant to be a Reiner. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Nick Reiner's life had always existed in the margins. While the world looked at the Reiners and saw glamour, success, and cohesion, Nick lived a different reality, one defined by distance, observation, and the subtle pressures of living in the shadow of a legendary father. The guest house where he resided was more than a physical separation from the main house. It was a metaphor for his emotional and psychological distance from a family that both nurtured and constrained him. Here, he was neither fully included nor completely outside the family, a liminal figure navigating the space between love and estrangement. From the outside, Nick's life might have seemed enviable. He was a son of Hollywood royalty, with access to wealth, education, and social circles that many could only dream of. Yet appearances were deceiving. Privilege came with its own set of pressures, expectations of success, comparison to a father whose reputation was monumental, and the unspoken demand to uphold the family's public image. Every action, every failure, every misstep carried the weight of scrutiny, whether overt or internalized. And while Nick appeared to be independent, the guest house's walls concealed a constant negotiation between autonomy and obligation, freedom and control. Inside the guest house, Nick's world was simultaneously self-contained and permeable. He could observe the main house, hear the faint echoes of family interactions, but rarely participate fully. He saw holidays celebrated with a careful choreography of smiles and niceties. He watched family conversations unfold like scripts he was expected to understand but never perform. This position gave him a unique perspective, but it also cultivated resentment. He understood the family's dynamics intimately, yet remained powerless to influence them in meaningful ways. In this liminal space, Nick's identity was in constant negotiation, shaped by proximity and distance alike. Those who knew Nick described him as quiet, introspective, and perhaps socially withdrawn, but also fiercely intelligent and perceptive. He absorbed details, noted inconsistencies, and observed behaviors that others might dismiss. This keen awareness, however, became a double-edged sword. The more he saw, the more he understood, and the more he was confronted by contradictions in the lives of those around him. Love coexisted with silence, loyalty coexisted with resentment, and the public persona coexisted with hidden truths. To live in the shadows is to see both sides, to understand the mechanics of facade and reality in ways that few others can. Jake would later come to realize that Nick's distance was not merely a matter of choice. It was a response to complex emotional pressures that had been accumulating over decades. The dynamics of the Reiner household, robustly public yet intensely private, created an environment where emotional expression was often constrained. Nick's choices, behavior, and isolation were shaped not by laziness or indifference, but by survival within an intricate family ecosystem. Every step he took, every word he spoke, had to navigate the unseen yet palpable currents of expectation, judgment, and potential disappointment. This life of observation and isolation had consequences. Nick's sense of self was intricately tied to both his proximity and distance from the main family. He was simultaneously inside and outside, simultaneously visible and invisible. The guest house provided him space, but it also reinforced boundaries that were impossible to breach. He could participate from a distance, watch the performances, observe the rituals, but intimate involvement was always limited. Every celebration, every argument, every moment of familial intimacy was filtered through a lens of separation, shaping Nick's worldview, emotional responses, and coping mechanisms. The secrecy and distance also created fertile ground for inner conflict. Nick's knowledge of hidden tensions and unspoken truths amplified feelings of isolation and helplessness. He understood dynamics that others could not see, yet lacked the power or permission to address them directly. The weight of awareness, combined with the constraints imposed by his marginal position, created pressure that had no natural outlet. This was the crucible in which much of Nick's later behavior was forged, a combination of intelligence, sensitivity, and a growing sense of entrapment within the family structure. Jake often thought about how this distance shaped Nick's interactions with him and the rest of the family. What appeared to outsiders as aloofness or detachment was, in reality, a complex survival strategy. Nick's quiet demeanor masked a torrent of thoughts, emotions, and observations. He had to balance appearances with internal truths, external expectations with private realities. And in the guest house, removed physically yet connected emotionally, he navigated these tensions constantly, building a version of himself that could endure the pressures imposed by both family and legacy. The guest house itself was emblematic of Nick's place within the Reiner family. It was well-appointed, comfortable, and aesthetically consistent with the main house, yet it was separate, a self-contained unit. This separation reflected his emotional position as well. Close enough to observe, distant enough to protect himself from full exposure to family dynamics. The architecture reinforced the psychological landscape, a visual reminder of the boundaries he had always occupied. And within this space, Nick's relationship with the main family evolved, fraught with complexity, unspoken grievances, and occasional bursts of connection that were fleeting yet intense. Within this framework, Nick's actions leading up to the tragic events of the estate take on new significance. The pressures of living in the shadows, the knowledge of family secrets, and the psychological strain of marginalization created conditions that were both subtle and profound. He had lived for years in an environment where emotional expression was limited, where visibility was carefully controlled, and where silence was often more powerful than speech. These factors did not excuse any violent behavior, but they contextualized the emotional and psychological backdrop against which the night unfolded. Jake also considered the impact of legacy on Nick's experience. Being the son of a public figure like Rob Reiner meant living under a constant gaze, whether explicit or internalized. Nick's every action was measured against the standard of his father's accomplishments and reputation. Failure, perceived or real, carried consequences that extended beyond personal embarrassment. It affected the family's public image, social relationships, and perceived cohesion. The weight of expectation, combined with the distance imposed by the guest house, created a tension that few outsiders could appreciate. And it was this tension that, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, defined much of Nick's life. Despite his isolation, Nick was not disconnected from emotional currents. He experienced love, frustration, loyalty, and anger intensely, yet he was forced to channel these emotions in constrained ways. Moments of genuine affection were rare and often fleeting. Conflicts, disagreements, and grievances simmered below the surface, expressed indirectly or suppressed entirely. And yet, beneath this restraint, there was a depth of observation and understanding that made Nick acutely aware of the family's complexities. This awareness, combined with his marginal position, made him both a participant and a witness, a person living simultaneously inside and outside the family narrative. Jake's retrospective understanding of Nick's life in the guest house also highlighted the broader theme of invisibility within families. It was not merely physical separation that mattered. It was emotional distance, the inability to be fully recognized, understood, or included. Nick's existence in the shadows was a product of both circumstance and family structure. He was a son, a brother, a member of a lineage, yet his daily life was shaped by observation, calculation, and adaptation. The guest house was his world, but it was also a prison of sorts, a place where autonomy existed within constraints and where knowledge of family truths could be both empowering and dangerous. And finally, the implications of Nick's life in the shadows became painfully clear on the night of the tragedy. The isolation, the pressure, the awareness of hidden secrets, all intersected in a way that made the events of that night almost inevitable. His position in the guest house was not neutral. It was a crucible in which his emotions, observations, and responses had been forged over decades. The house, the distance, the hidden knowledge. It all converged, setting the stage for a night that would forever alter the family and the estate. Nick's story is not one easily summarized, nor is it simple. It is the story of a son living in proximity yet estrangement, of a human being navigating the tension between love and observation, freedom and constraint, visibility and invisibility. His life in the guest house shaped the dynamics of the Reiner family, influenced his interactions with his parents and siblings, and contextualized the events that followed in ways that are crucial to understand. To grasp the tragedy of that night, one must first understand the life that led up to it, the quiet, shadowed existence of a son who lived on the periphery yet carried the weight of an entire family in his mind and heart. But what happened next would thrust Nick from the shadows into the center of a story no one could have anticipated, and it would reveal layers of secrecy that even Jake had yet to imagine. It was an ordinary afternoon when Jake Reiner first noticed the jewelry box. Ordinary, that is, until the ordinary ceased to exist. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, with sunlight streaming through the tall windows and dust motes dancing in the air. In that stillness, objects seemed to take on lives of their own. Drawers creaked open with exaggerated intent, bookshelves stood like silent sentinels, and in the corner of a familiar room, the jewelry box waited, small, unassuming, yet heavy with unspoken weight. Jake had walked past this drawer countless times before, never paying it much attention. It was the kind of drawer that blends into the environment, a neutral presence, holding mundane items like spare keys, receipts, and old notes. But that day, something made him pause. Perhaps it was a flicker of intuition, a whisper of unease in the back of his mind. Or maybe it was the cumulative effect of grief, trauma, and curiosity converging in that precise moment. Whatever it was, Jake felt compelled to open the box, unaware that doing so would shift the very ground beneath his feet. The jewelry box itself was exquisite in its simplicity. A velvet-lined exterior gave way to a small, intricate lock. Its corners were slightly worn, evidence of decades of handling, yet it had been preserved with care. This duality, fragile yet deliberate, was emblematic of the secret it contained. Jake's fingers traced the edges of the box as he debated whether to lift the lid. Was this intrusion? Or was it inevitability? The sense of tension was palpable, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when long-hidden truths would finally be revealed. He lifted the lid slowly, almost ceremoniously, and the contents were at once beautiful and devastating. Inside lay a collection of rings, watches, and trinkets, but one item immediately caught his eye. a wedding ring unlike any he had ever seen. Its metal gleamed softly in the light, and an engraving along the inner band immediately drew his attention. Jake's heart began to race as he read the name etched into the gold, a name that did not belong to his mother, Michelle. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. For a moment, Jake could do nothing but stare, the air thick around him, his mind racing. How could this be possible? How could the father he had known, the man who had built a life with Michelle Reiner, have another secret? And if he did, who else knew about it? The questions came fast and relentless, each one a spike of anxiety and disbelief. Jake had always trusted his instincts, and in that instant, he realized that he had been blind to a dimension of his father's life that no one had suspected. This was more than a discovery. It was a confrontation with history. The ring, delicate and enduring, symbolized a relationship that had been carefully concealed. It carried with it implications that were both legal and emotional, private and profound. Jake could feel the weight of decades pressing down through the small box, through the ring itself. Every moment, every decision, every family interaction now seemed reframed in light of this revelation. The past was no longer a series of memories. It was a puzzle, and this ring was the first piece in a larger, hidden picture. As Jake examined the box, his mind naturally began to trace patterns, timelines, and connections. He remembered subtle inconsistencies, fleeting mentions, odd glances exchanged between his parents, moments that had seemed trivial at the time but now resonated with new meaning. The realization was both frightening and liberating. He could now see what had been invisible, and the clarity was both a gift and a burden. Knowledge, he realized, was not neutral. It demanded reckoning. The emotional response was immediate. Tears came unbidden, hot and sudden, as if the weight of family history could not be contained. He felt grief, not only for the parents he had lost violently, but for the parent he had thought he knew. A dual mourning took hold. One for the loss of life, one for the loss of certainty, for the revelation that reality was far more complex than appearances suggested. Grief was compounded by anger, confusion, and a profound sense of betrayal. The jewelry box had become a vessel of revelation, and Jake could not unsee what it contained. Yet even as he struggled to process the discovery, practical questions intruded. Who else had access to this box? Had anyone known about it? Could there be additional items hidden elsewhere, items that might further complicate an already tangled reality? The house, in its silence, seemed to whisper answers and simultaneously withhold them. Jake was acutely aware that this was not merely a private matter. It had implications for his family, for the narrative of his parents' lives, and for the public image carefully maintained over decades. The ring itself was remarkable, not only for its hidden status, but for its craftsmanship. The gold was polished and warm, the engraving precise and deliberate. Whoever had worn it, or had it made, had intended permanence. The hidden family, the secret union, or unacknowledged relationship suggested by the ring was no fleeting dalliance. This was a deliberate choice, an intentional concealment. Jake's mind raced with possibilities. Another family, a long-term affair, legal implications, emotional consequences. Every scenario carried its own weight, and none offered comfort. Jake also thought about his siblings. How would they react if they knew? Romy, who had already witnessed tragedy and had warned police about a dangerous family member, might have insights he did not. How would this knowledge reshape their understanding of their parents, of the family, and of each other? The box was no longer just a repository of jewelry. It was a fulcrum, capable of pivoting the entire family narrative in a new, potentially destabilizing direction. Amidst these reflections, Jake felt the physical presence of the box pressing into his awareness. It was small, yet its impact was monumental. Every piece of jewelry, every engraving, every hidden compartment carried with it a story, a decision, a life carefully lived and deliberately concealed. He realized, in a moment of stark clarity, that the house itself had become a character in this drama, a silent witness, a custodian of secrets, and an architect of revelation. The estate, which had once seemed orderly, familiar, and protective, was now a landscape of mystery, its every corner a potential clue in a story he had barely begun to understand. And yet, For all the intellectual parsing and emotional reckoning, one truth remained undeniable. Jake's discovery was only the beginning. The jewelry box had revealed a secret, yes, but it had also opened the door to questions he was not yet prepared to answer. Was there more? How deep did this hidden life run? Could this secret family be connected, in some way, to the violence that had consumed the estate? The intersections of grief, betrayal, and hidden truths loomed large, casting shadows over every memory, every assumption, every certainty he had held. As he carefully closed the box, Jake felt a strange combination of fear, sorrow, and anticipation. The house was silent again, but the silence was no longer benign. It was charged, electric with potential revelation. And as Jake stood there, processing what he had seen, he understood that the path ahead was fraught with difficulty. Secrets, once uncovered, cannot be ignored. The box had spoken, but its story was only beginning. What Jake would uncover next would challenge everything he thought he knew, not just about his father, but about his entire family, their past, and the hidden threads that bound them together. And what came next would not just shock him. It would leave him questioning the very foundation of the life he thought he had known. Jake Reiner could hardly believe what he was seeing. The ring resting in the velvet of the jewelry box seemed ordinary at first glance. Gold, simple, elegant. But it didn't belong. It didn't belong to the mother he had known, the woman who had shared decades of life with his father, the woman whose image of love had shaped his childhood understanding of family. The engraving inside was precise, delicate, and unmistakable. A name, a history, a secret life that no one in the family had ever acknowledged. Jake's hands trembled as he lifted it out, feeling the weight of years, of hidden decisions, of lives carefully compartmentalized. How could a simple piece of jewelry carry so much meaning? And yet, here it was, an unassuming gold band, a key to understanding truths that had been deliberately obscured. He turned it over, examining every angle, every curve, every mark. His mind raced through possibilities. Was this a token of love from the past? A symbol of an affair? Or perhaps evidence of an entire life lived in parallel, a life that had existed unbeknownst to the rest of the family? The first wave of emotion was shock. The recognition that his father, Rob Reiner, had harbored a secret relationship was disorienting. The man who had seemed so transparent, so consistent, so devoted. How could he have lived another life without anyone noticing? Jake's thoughts oscillated between disbelief and curiosity. Could it be an old fling, a youthful indiscretion? Or was it something far more enduring, something that had existed alongside the marriage that everyone had assumed was unbreakable? Next came the grief, not just for the parents he had lost violently, but for the father he had thought he knew. Everything he believed about the family, the shared history, the identity of those closest to him, now felt uncertain. The ring was a tangible representation of betrayal, a physical manifestation of secrecy and concealment. Every memory, every story, every lesson he had internalized about love, loyalty, and trust was suddenly reframed. The emotional dissonance was almost too much to bear. Jake began to consider the practical implications. Who else had known about this ring? Who had access to it? And who had kept it hidden? Could there be other objects, letters, or documents that would further illuminate this secret? The jewelry box had already reshaped his understanding of the family. What else might it contain? Each possibility carried a mix of fear, anticipation, and moral complexity. The ring was a doorway, and stepping through it meant confronting realities that could destabilize everything he thought he understood about his father and about himself. The engraving itself was haunting. Names, dates, or initials, whatever they were, spoke of intentionality, permanence, and commitment. This was no casual or fleeting object. It was crafted to endure, to remain hidden but intact, to survive the passage of time. Jake's eyes traced the lines again and again, searching for clues, patterns, and hidden meanings. Each glance seemed to deepen the emotional impact, as if the ring were alive, communicating across decades of silence. Jake could not help but reflect on the psychological weight of the discovery. Secrets of this magnitude do more than surprise. They reshape perception. They challenge memory, force reevaluation of relationships, and require the construction of new narratives to accommodate truths long ignored. The ring's existence suggested that his father had maintained dual realities, two parallel lives, and that the facade presented to the public and family alike had been meticulously maintained. How could someone balance such complexity, such deception, for decades? And why now, after all this time, was Jake the one to uncover it? The emotional tension was compounded by guilt. Jake felt a strange sense of responsibility, as though discovering the ring imposed an obligation to understand, to confront, and perhaps to expose. But at the same time, there was fear. Fear of what uncovering more could reveal. Fear of family fractures. Fear of the consequences of bringing hidden truths into the light. He understood, viscerally, that some secrets, once discovered, cannot be ignored, and that the act of seeing can never be undone. Jake's thoughts turned to his siblings, particularly Romy. How would she react if she knew the existence of this ring? Could it explain some of her cryptic warnings to the police, her concerns about a dangerous family member? Was there a connection between this hidden relationship and the tragedy that had befallen their parents? The questions multiplied, each one more unsettling than the last. Yet amidst the confusion and emotional turbulence, Jake felt a strange clarity. The ring, while shocking, was a piece of the puzzle that allowed him to see patterns that had been invisible before. He began to connect fragments of memory. Conversations half remembered, mentions of a friend or colleague whose role in family life had seemed minor, fleeting references that now seemed loaded with significance. The ring was both a revelation and a lens, providing clarity even as it deepened the mystery. He thought too about the symbolic power of the ring. Wedding rings are more than jewelry. They are commitments, promises, declarations of love and loyalty. This ring had been hidden, its significance cloaked, yet it still carried all the emotional weight of its purpose. Jake realized that his father had not merely concealed an object. He had concealed a life, a set of choices, and the very essence of a relationship. The ethical, emotional, and psychological implications were staggering. Even as Jake grappled with the immediate shock, he felt the pull of curiosity, an irresistible drive to understand the story behind the ring. Who had worn it? Who had given it? Was there someone else in the world, someone who had known Rob intimately, whose life had been shaped by this secret love? The ring demanded answers, and Jake felt compelled to follow its trail, knowing that doing so could uncover truths that might never have been anticipated. And yet, even as he considered these possibilities, the weight of grief and fear persisted. The violent deaths of his parents, the arrest of Nick, Romy's warnings, all intersected with the discovery of the ring in ways that were almost impossible to untangle. Every thought seemed to lead to more questions, each one a spike of anxiety and emotional intensity. The house, the jewelry box, the ring, they were all interconnected, each element amplifying the others, creating a tension that left Jake both terrified and compelled. Finally, after hours of examination, Jake set the ring down carefully, aware that he was standing at the precipice of discovery. The object itself was small, yet its impact was monumental. It represented hidden love, secrecy, and the invisible lines that can exist within families. It was a key to understanding both the past and present, a lens through which the family's history could be reframed. And while he knew that uncovering more might be painful, he also understood that he could not turn away. What Jake would find next, as he began to piece together the implications of the ring, would challenge everything he thought he knew about his father and the family, and it would set the stage for revelations that were more shocking than he could have imagined. But what came next would leave him questioning not only the truth of his family's past, but the very meaning of trust, loyalty, and love, and nothing would ever feel the same again. The moment Jake realized the ring hinted at another life, another family, a chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the winter air drifting through the Brentwood estate. For decades, he had lived in a world where family was everything, where trust and love were constants, where the identity of his father, Rob Reiner, had been fixed and unquestionable. But the jewelry box had shattered that certainty. The ring, small and unassuming, was proof of something monumental. A life hidden in plain sight, a love unacknowledged, a family that had existed alongside their own. Jake's mind raced as he tried to conceptualize it. Another family? Was it a long-term relationship? Had there been children? Had Rob Reiner led two parallel lives while maintaining the polished image the world saw? These were questions that no one in the family, or outside of it, could have anticipated. The mere possibility felt like a betrayal, a fracture in the very foundation of what he had been taught to believe about love, marriage, and loyalty. It was the weight of the unknown that was most unbearable. The ring was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a signal, a marker pointing to a hidden reality. Every glance, every whispered memory of his father, every anecdote he had ever been told now carried an additional layer of ambiguity. The Reiner household, which had seemed orderly and harmonious, was now a tapestry of secrets, threads pulling at each other in ways Jake had never imagined. Jake began piecing together what little evidence he could find. Conversations he had thought trivial suddenly took on significance. The fleeting mentions of friends or colleagues, the names that had appeared once in passing and been forgotten, the odd coincidences of timing. These were no longer random. They were clues, breadcrumbs scattered over decades, waiting for someone perceptive enough to follow them. And now, with the jewelry box in hand, Jake had the first piece of the map. He also thought about Michelle, his mother. What would she have felt if she had known? Was she aware of this hidden life? Had she suspected, or had the secrecy been so perfect that even she was in the dark? The questions tormented him. Part of the grief he felt over her death was compounded by the knowledge that she had lived, possibly, alongside a truth that would have shocked her deeply. And now that she was gone, the answers would have to come from elsewhere: fragments, memories, and the careful reconstruction of hidden history. Jake's curiosity was now intertwined with fear. If Rob Reiner had kept another family secret, it wasn't just a personal betrayal. It could have consequences, legal, emotional, and social, that extended far beyond the Reiner household. He began to consider the possibility of reaching out, of trying to trace names, dates, and connections. But with each question came a fear. What if the person he contacted didn't want to be found? What if there were people whose lives had been carefully constructed around secrecy and whose existence was threatened by discovery? The weight of these thoughts was almost physical. Jake felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, where every revelation could topple him into a world of confusion, anger, and heartbreak. The hidden family was not just a concept. It was a reality that had likely been carefully insulated, with boundaries, agreements, and secrecy that had endured for decades. And now, those boundaries were exposed, fragile under the light of discovery. Jake's research began in the quietest parts of the estate. The corners of rooms, drawers, and cupboards he had previously ignored. He looked for letters, documents, photographs, anything that could confirm the existence of another family. Every object he touched seemed charged with meaning, every detail amplified by the knowledge he now carried. The jewelry box had opened a door, and with it came a flood of possibilities that were simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. As he worked, he also considered the psychological implications. Rob Reiner had been a master of compartmentalization. To maintain two lives, or even a long-term secret, required skill, caution, and emotional intelligence. Every interaction, every public appearance, every family gathering would have needed to be carefully navigated. Jake marveled at the complexity, even as he grappled with the betrayal. It was a reminder that people's lives are rarely as simple as they seem. Secrets can coexist with love, loyalty, and public persona, and yet those secrets have power to reshape reality once revealed. The emotional landscape Jake navigated was equally complex. He felt anger, betrayal, grief, and sorrow, but also a profound sense of fascination. The discovery of a hidden family was a revelation that demanded exploration, that demanded understanding. And yet, he could not shake the fear of what uncovering more could mean. The hidden life implied by the ring suggested a story that extended far beyond the jewelry box, and Jake realized that each answer would lead to more questions, each discovery to further emotional upheaval. He also reflected on the broader consequences. Another family could explain certain patterns in his father's behavior, the emotional distance at times, the unexplained absences or peculiar decisions. It could provide context, perhaps even clarity, to the fractured relationships within the household. But it could also introduce new complications, new conflicts, and new heartbreak. The implications were profound. And yet, despite the fear, Jake pressed on. He understood that secrets, once uncovered, cannot be ignored. The ring had spoken. It had demanded attention. The hidden family, whatever form it took, was now part of his reality, part of the story he would need to understand, document, and, ultimately, navigate. Every day brought him closer to the truth, but also closer to the emotional precipice that had already begun to shake under the weight of what he had discovered. As night fell over the estate, Jake sat with the jewelry box open before him, the ring glinting softly in the dim light. He imagined the lives it represented, the people whose existence had been hidden, the choices his father had made to protect, conceal, or compartmentalize. And as the shadows lengthened across the walls, he realized that the hidden family was not a story that could be solved easily. It was a labyrinth of emotion, history, and secrecy, and entering it would demand courage, patience, and a willingness to confront truths that could forever change his understanding of his own family. But what Jake would discover next about the hidden family would shatter even his most carefully held assumptions and reveal a twist that no one could have anticipated. After the initial shock of discovering the ring and the implications of a hidden family, Jake Reiner knew he couldn't simply sit in silence. The jewelry box had opened a door, and now he had to follow the trail of clues, no matter where it led.